The Alpha platoons were engaged in a nasty close quarters fight for 90 minutes. Sergeant John Eder later described it as like a gang fight, and that it got down to knives, it got down to choking people. The opposing sides didn't see each other in the elephant grass until they were at close range. They were killing each other with bullets and grenades, and with bayonets, knives and shovels. This channel's mission is to challenge the Vietnam orthodoxy. Much of what you know about the Vietnam War is either incomplete or false. To support this channel and its mission, please subscribe and like the video. The battle at X-Ray had essentially been fought with 3 NVA battalions: the 7th and 9th battalions of the 66th Regiment, the 33rd Composite Battalion, and supporting regimental arms. The 8th Battalion of the 66th had started moving toward X-Ray late on November 15th, when its mission and direction of march was changed. Field Front had decided resistance at X-Ray was too stubborn to overcome, and on November 16th it withdrew its battalions northwest along the base of the Chu Pang to recover. But if resistance at X-Ray was too strong, Field Front concluded, the American artillery bases might be vulnerable. The NVA had been confused by landing zone Macon on the 15th, and scouts wasted time in the area before realising American artillery had spent only a short time there before moving to landing zone Columbus. 8th Battalion, 66th Regiment was now moving toward Columbus from the west, while the Viet Cong's H-15 Main Force Battalion was approaching from the south. The Field Front Commander, Senior Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Huan, and 66th Regiment Commander Lieutenant Colonel La Gao Chow shared the same thought. General Va Nguyen Giap's dictum, "You must win the first battle." As far as Anne was concerned, the fight with the Americans that had started on X-Ray was not over. The night of November 16th had been quiet on X-Ray, and patrols revealed a lack of enemy in the area. B-52 strikes were imminent, and with a minimum 3 km safe zone required, the 2 battalions on X-Ray quickly organised an overland march out of the area. 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, 1st Cavalry Division would lead the march over the ridge that formed the eastern boundary of the basin in which X-Ray was located, with 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry following. When they were 3 km east of the ridge, 2-5 would continue the 1500 metres to Columbus, while 2-7 would head 2,500 metres northwest to Albany. This movement was part of a larger plan. With victory anticipated on the Western Plateau, the ARVN wanted to commit the 2 battalions of its Saigon-based Airborne Brigade. The initial plan called for the brigade to operate south of Duc Cu, moving toward the Ia Drang, while the cavalry worked west and north, driving the NVA onto the ARVN. Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General Richard T. Knowles, had wanted to drive direct into the Chu Pong Massif, but the Air Force had dropped a number of 5,000-pound bombs in the area, and their delay fuses were set to go off over a 2-week period. 3rd Brigade would therefore only skirt the base of the mountain. 3rd Brigade Commander, Colonel Tim Brown, planned to have 2-7 sweep the area between Columbus and a location 4 km north and just east of X-Ray. The battalion would set up a perimeter there and send out company-sized patrols toward the mountains and through the Ia Drang Valley. The brigade would then air assault 2-5 into a landing zone further north. The 2nd of the 5th began its movement at 9 am. Tully had artillery fire ahead of his lead company, Boyd's Charlie Company, as it moved toward Columbus. Reaching a point the artillery could no longer fire in support of his battalion, Tully offered firing data to McDade so that 2-7 could have the same support. However, McDade declined the offer. Brown had earlier dispatched Bravo Company 2-7 and 3rd Platoon from Alpha 2-7 to reinforce X-Ray, and these men were now resting at Camp Holloway. To make up for this, Brown assigned Alpha Company 1-5 to McDade, and McDade gave the battalion reconnaissance platoon to Alpha Company to make up for the loss of its 3rd platoon. The order of march 2-7 used is unclear, but it did use a battalion column formation, a formation most experienced commanders would not have used. However, McDade was not an experienced infantry commander. He had commanded a platoon in the Pacific in World War II and had been a company commander in Korea, but he hadn't led troops for 10 years. The greater part of his experience had been in personnel. He had been Division G1 for more than 2 years before taking over 2-7. Major General Harry W. Kinnaird, 1st Cavalry Division Commander, stated McDade was the best man for the job, but this choice was likely a measure of his loyalty to hard-working subordinates, as better candidates were available. Kinnaird's former aide, Major Frank Henry, was made Battalion Executive Officer, and rather than spend his time in the rear area, which was customary for the position, Henry followed McDade closely. The 2nd of the 7th had formerly been with the 2nd Infantry Division as the 2nd of the 9th. The battalion had little air-mobile training before departing for Vietnam, but it was a solid and well-trained infantry unit, and its company commanders were considered among the best in the division. Captain Joel E. Sugdinis led Alpha Company, Captain John A. Fesmeyer Charlie, while Captain Henry Thorpe led Delta. The battalion also had strong leadership at the non-commissioned officer level, with many of the senior non-coms having had combat experience in Korea. Alpha Company in the lead, 2-7 now turned northwest toward Albany. The company was exhausted. The men had been on 100% alert after arriving at X-Ray on the 15th, and before moving out, each man had been instructed to take 2 APC tablets. The tablets combined aspirin with a mild stimulant, and it was hoped this would raise the men's alertness. The company moved in wedge formation, the battalion reconnaissance platoon on point, 1st platoon on the right, 2nd platoon on the left, the command group between them, with the mortar platoon trailing. Company Commander Sugdinis, his RTOs and the artillery forward observer, 2nd Lieutenant Hank Dunn, were to the right of the formation centre. Company Executive Officer 1st Lieutenant S. Lawrence Gwynn, 2 RTOs and 1st Sergeant Miller were to their left. The reconnaissance platoon, led by 2nd Lieutenant Pat Payne, was placed on point because it was well rested. Sugdinis had only 1 platoon led by an officer, the 2nd, under 2nd Lieutenant Gordon A. Grove. 1st platoon was led by Platoon Sergeant James L. Fisher, and the mortar platoon was led by Sergeant 1st Class Braden. In a later detailed chronology of the battle, Gwynn stated the company formation was good and tight until it reached Albany. However, the trailing companies were in column, with no indication they were putting out flank security. The orders given to company commanders were ambiguous. The enemy situation was unclear, and while NVA units were in the area, 2-7 was moving to Albany for probable pickup and movement to Pleiku. At 12:40 p.m, 200 metres from Albany, Alpha Company's 1st platoon captured 2 NVA soldiers without firing a shot. McDade immediately ordered the column to halt and moved forward with his command group. The men were in khaki uniforms and carried SKS carbines. They told the interpreter they were part of a larger group of about a dozen men that were sick with malaria and had deserted. The after-action report, however, would observe that the 2 men were probably an outpost of an NVA unit in its assembly area. The capture and interrogation of the men took about 20 minutes. S2 notified Brigade of their capture, and the prisoners were moved back into the column. McDade then ordered Alpha to proceed to Albany, and he stayed with the company as it moved forward. The rest of the battalion had become disorganised. Behind Alpha, the Charlie Company platoons had dropped in the grass and were emptying canteens of water. The men were exhausted. Air mobility was supposed to deliver them fresh to battle, but for some reason 3rd Brigade had decided not to use the available lift to manoeuvre the battalion. The 2 prisoners were in fact part of a flank security patrol from 8th Battalion, 66th Regiment. The NVA battalion was moving perpendicular to the American column, and its presence was reported to the NVA commander by his flank scouts. He believed the American unit was in fact a company, and he decided to conduct an L-shaped hasty ambush, with the base of the L at the header of the American column, the longer axis parallel to its length. The NVA commander ordered his lead rifle company to quickly approach to within 100 metres of the American flank, keeping 1 company in reserve to the west and north of Albany. The signal to wheel into the attack would be mortars hitting the Americans. The NVA didn't have much time. The commander was willing to allow the American column to approach close to his own column to give his flanking force time to get into position, while at the base of the ambush, automatic weapons crews deployed along the base of anthills and hardwoods, using grass and twigs to conceal their positions. With the American column now moving again, Alpha Company and McDade's command group reached Albany. Albany was not a single clearing surrounded by trees. The small clearing Alpha leader Sugdinis thought was Albany was in fact only the first of two clearings, and was separated from a larger clearing beyond it by a lightly wooded island. Within that grove of trees were at least 3 giant termite hills. McDade then called his company commanders forward, with their radio operators and first sergeants, so that he could show them the positions he wanted their companies to occupy at Albany. Alpha had started securing the clearing. Sugdinis dispatched the recon platoon across the clearing to set up to the northwest, with 1st platoon to the right and 2nd to the left. He ordered the mortar platoon to set up its tubes near a group of anthills and a grove of trees toward the centre of the clearing. Specialist 4 Dick Ackerman was point man on the right flank of the recon platoon. We had gone about 100 feet when we heard some shots, then more shots, and finally all hell broke loose. Within seconds of firing being heard from the direction of 1st platoon, the clump of mortar rounds erupted on the left of Albany, in the area 2nd platoon had moved into the tree line. The volume of fire then increased, and rounds began to buzz across the entire landing zone. Fesmeyer and Thorpe had just joined the battalion command group when the firing began. Fesmeyer couldn't know that the NVA's main flanking thrust was directed at the body of his company. He would not get back to lead his men, and radio conversations with his executive officer, 1st Lieutenant Donald C. Cornett, would soon cease when Cornett was killed. With mortar rounds now hitting Albany, the NVA flanking company wheeled to assault the American column. The men of Charlie Company and the Delta Mortar Platoon were rising to their feet when the ambush began, firing moving from the head of the column to the middle. As the ambush began to envelop the column, NVA snipers scrambled into the trees to snipe at anyone moving in the tall grass. The Charlie troopers returned fire, which was at first uncoordinated, but as the NCOs began to exert leadership, firing became more disciplined. The Delta Company mortarmen were also being hit hard. Their firing was also wild, and Alpha's 2nd platoon was taking casualties from M16s. At the rear of the column, Captain George Forrest, in command of Alpha Company 1-5, had placed a platoon at the head of his column, with 2 squads abreast. The right squad now began to put M16 and M60 fire into the flank of the attacking NVA. Forrest immediately turned back toward Alpha from Albany when the first mortar rounds came into the clearing, his 2 radio operators killed as the men raced 500 yards back to the company. When he reached the lead elements of his company, he ordered the platoon leader to pull back into a perimeter. Alpha Company was being assaulted by platoon-size elements, but the company had enough tactical integrity remaining to establish a hasty perimeter. However, because it was so dispersed, the lead platoon suffered the heaviest casualties, while buying time for the rest of the company. The Alpha platoons were engaged in a nasty close-quarters fight for 90 minutes. Sergeant John Eder later described it as like a gang fight, and that it got down to knives, it got down to choking people. The opposing sides didn't see each other in the elephant grass until they were at close range. They were killing each other with bullets and grenades, and with bayonets, knives and shovels. The fight was a collection of individual fights, and from platoon level up, leaders had no idea what was happening. When Forrest reached the main body of Alpha, he began to organise his men. He discovered lead elements of 2-7 were in heavy contact to their front and west, but he quickly lost contact with McDade. Rifleman Jim Young remarked, "Captain Forrest came running along our line. He was stopping and telling everybody where to go. I don't know how he kept from getting hit." Fesmeyer was close to Albany. He believed his Charlie Company was close enough that it could reach the clearing if it moved quickly. Fesmeyer talked with Lieutenant Cornett. Firing was intense, he reported, and mortar fire was hitting the company. He ordered Cornett to get the company moving along the right flank of Delta. Fesmeyer wanted to get Charlie out of the mortar kill zone, protect Delta's flank, and consolidate the battalion. As Fesmeyer tried moving back toward Charlie Company, he could see NVA moving toward his men. Cornet had the company moving, but they ran headlong into the NVA. The Americans were outnumbered, and the result was an intense hand-to-hand fight. Without Fesmeyer, and with Cornet now dead, company cohesion disintegrated into an individual fight for life. Charlie Company would suffer the heaviest casualties of any American unit at Albany. The company began the engagement with 112 men, but by the next day 45 would be dead, with more than 50 wounded. The Delta Company commander, Captain Henry Thorpe, was 100 yards forward of his company when the fighting started. He helped organise a defensive perimeter with his first sergeant and his radio operator. Specialist 4 Bob Tolles was with Delta's anti-tank platoon. The sound of firing on our right flank got our attention. A couple of senior NCOs moved forward and joined the line of enlisted men. We formed a solid battle line, 12 of us. As bullets whizzed overhead, the men waited, expecting to see flank security break cover and enter their perimeter. Instead, North Vietnamese troops shattered the foliage and headed straight for us, AK-47 rifles blazing. They kept pouring out of the woodline, we kept firing, then finally they stopped coming. Tolles looked toward the Delta mortar platoon. The ground was opening up and swallowing the mortarmen. They fell so fast, a brown wave of death rolled over them and on into Charlie Company. With the NVA flanking them, Sergeant Jerry Baker took command, and Tolles and the other men gathered their wounded and withdrew under fire. The battalion's assistant operations sergeant, Sergeant Jim Gooden, was with the headquarters detachment toward the rear of the column. We were getting fire from 3 sides. Then we got hit by mortars. I looked around and everybody was dead. They were closing in for the final assault. I was shooting, trying to break a hole through them. I went the wrong way, right into the killing zone. I found stacks of GIs. The NVA commander quickly realised the American column was larger than he had thought, and he decided to commit his reserve company, reinforcing the flanking company. Sugdenis and Gwyn had reached the edge of Albany when the column began to receive intense fire. The 2 men then ran to the island and took cover by a large anthill. They struggled to control the situation. The clearing was surrounded on 3 sides, and anyone moving was shot at. When 1st Platoon, Alpha Company 27, reported that it was surrounded and taking heavy casualties, Sugdenis told the platoon sergeant to manoeuvre back toward the centre of the clearing. One more transmission was received from them, a report that all the men were either dead or wounded, and that the platoon was being overrun. Then the radio was silent. Sugdenis turned to Gwyn and said, "I've lost 1st Platoon." Sergeant First Class William A. Ferrell, platoon sergeant for 2nd Platoon, came on the radio. Ferrell was a 38-year-old veteran of World War II and Korea. He was known as Pappy by the men. Pappy told him that his platoon was mixed up with the NVA, and he asked where Sugdenis was. Then he radioed that he had been hit, and that he was with 3 or 4 men that had also been hit. Sugdenis did not hear from Pappy again. He did not survive the battle. 2nd Platoon was still intact, although it had lost a number of men, and Grove was pleading for someone to stop friendlies firing into their position. Gwyn looked down the path Alpha Company had moved down and saw NVA soldiers behind them. There were also Americans running from that direction, sprinting to the anthill where Gwyn was located. McDade was demanding everyone cease fire, as he thought the incoming rounds were friendly fire. Gwyn and others believed McDade was ineffective during this time. Indeed, McDade sat quietly against a tree and left other officers to lead. But it's questionable how much control he could have exerted over the battle once it had started, due to its confused nature. The Air Force liaison officer, the battalion command sergeant major, and a wounded PFC were with Gwyn at the anthill. Within minutes, the men spotted about 20 NVA soldiers moving toward them. Killing or wounding all the attackers, they stopped enemy movement to their left front for the moment. The recon platoon had found itself virtually in the centre of the NVA battalion, but using good fire discipline and movement, Payne started manoeuvring his men back toward the anthills, taking their wounded with them. 3 men had been killed during the initial ambush. Payne then put his men in a defensive perimeter on the northwest side of the anthills. Later, Payne recalled that after repelling 2 or 3 NVA attacks, he spotted what must have been a company commander, running back and forth along his line of men, encouraging and rallying them. He then led a second attack. After a third attempt, the NVA didn't try to come across the landing zone again. They started coming around to the north side. A few Delta Company men had made their way to the clearing, and Gwyn put them on the recon platoon's left flank, while the Alpha motormen were placed to the east. By 1:26 p.m, Sugdenis, his executive officer, the recon platoon and McDade's command group were in the small wooded area between the 2 clearings, each group huddled around a termite hill. The head of the battalion had been cut from the body. Gwyn waved to 3 Americans running through the tall grass, and the men immediately headed toward him. The first man to reach the clearing was Captain Kenneth L. Weitzel, the 229th Helicopter Liaison Officer. He was followed by the battalion Sergeant Major Jim Scott and a young PFC. The young man was holding his guts in with his hands and asking, "Are the helicopters coming?" Jim Scott was soon shot through the chest. Gwyn ordered him to bandage himself, and ripping off his shirt, Scott picked up his M16 and headed to one of the anthills. Scott remembers, "I took a bullet through my chest, not more than 15 or 20 minutes into the battle. Everything happened at once. I did not see a hole being dug prior to 8 p.m. that night. Within half an hour there was an attempt to organise groups into a defensive position. Individuals did this. I think that is what saved us." Lieutenant Gordon Grove, 2nd Platoon, Alpha Company 2-7, then stumbled into the American position with 2 wounded men. Grove wanted help to go back with him to get his men out, but Sugdenis refused. He didn't have anyone to spare. He then asked permission to speak to McDade, but McDade also refused Grove's request. The duty officer in the operations centre at Brigade headquarters had only a slight idea of what was developing. Brigade was more concerned about sending a helicopter to bring the 2 prisoners back for interrogation. Brown had been visiting Falcon and was heading to Kateka when radio transmissions from Albany became frantic. Casualty numbers reported were so high that they were at first dismissed. Now notified of the contact, Brown flew over the area, but he couldn't make out any details on the ground. His fire support coordinator, Tadimi, wanted to call in artillery, but it was impossible to define the front line. Brown talked to McDade. He didn't know what was happening. Nobody knew what was going on. The Air Force Liaison Officer was now talking with Executive Officer Major Henry, an Army aviator, and the men ordered airstrikes, placing them on 3 sides of the clearing. Aerial rocket artillery was also called in, and Major Roger J. Blackbart Bartholomew's 2nd Battalion, 20th Artillery, directed by Henry, worked over the area to the north, northeast, northwest, and west of the American column. A flight of A-1Es from Pleiku then made napalm runs. The men around the anthills tossed out coloured smoke to mark their positions, and Gwyn watched as the silver canisters tumbled from the wings of the aircraft across the front and sides of the clearing, breaking on treetops and splashing burning napalm through large groups of NVA. Gwyn watched in horror as 2 canisters then splashed through the area 2nd Platoon, Alpha Company, was thought to be. But finally the NVA attack was broken. An entire NVA company would be destroyed by a napalm strike 100 metres from the Americans as it prepared to attack. At 2 p.m, Brown ordered Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Ackerson, commanding 1st Battalion 5th Cavalry, to send a company overland from Columbus to Albany. Ackerson was in his command helicopter with his S-3 and the commander of Bravo Company, Captain Walter B. Tully, cousin of the 2-5 Battalion commander, when he received the order. The men were looking at possible landing zones for future operations when the call was received. They flew to Albany, arriving in time to witness the smoke of battle rising along a length of jungle around 1,000 metres in length. Tully radioed Columbus and had his company prepare to move when he arrived. The company started its move at 2:42 p.m. The advance elements reached forest perimeter around 6 p.m, and Tully reported Alpha 1-5 had taken many casualties and still had men missing. Bravo 1-5 and Delta 2-7 then expanded their small perimeter to create a single ship landing zone, and helicopters were called in to evacuate the most seriously wounded. Brown also alerted Bravo 27 at Camp Holloway for immediate movement to Albany. The company would be moved to the landing zone in one lift, approaching from the south and east. Henry advised the troopers on landing to fire to the left and run to the anthills to the right. The flight approached the landing zone 3 times, but each time the helicopters were driven off by heavy fire. Each time gunships from the Lift Battalion and ARA punished the NVA, and finally fire slackened enough for Bravo 27 to be inserted into Albany. Gwynn remembered Rick Riscola, leading 1st Platoon Bravo Company, swaggering into the perimeter holding an M16, M79 and a bugle he had picked up at X-ray. He also recalled how his infectious enthusiasm improved the morale of the original defenders. By 6:30 p.m, de Duroc had his full company of about 90 men at Albany, and the perimeter had been expanded to cover the entire clearing. Given control of all ground elements on the landing zone, de Duroc integrated the survivors into his platoons. Fesmire dug in that night with the 9 survivors of his company. The North Vietnamese also reinforced the fight. Remnants of NVA units battered at X-ray, the 33rd Regiment, the 320th and the 7th Battalion of the 66th were close to Albany, and they were ordered to march toward the battle. How many additional men reached the fight is unknown, but it's probable many hundreds reinforced 8th Battalion. The wounded evacuated, Tully and Forrest began moving toward where they believed the rest of 27 was located, Bravo 15 in the lead. Moving in a company wedge, Bravo had moved only 400 metres to the northwest toward Albany when its 3 platoons began receiving very heavy small arms, automatic weapons and RPG fire. The fire was coming from a tree line to Bravo's front. Sergeant Mike Cox and Private First Class Ralph Ernst were killed and 3 other men wounded. Tully quickly realised he had no alternative but to immediately assault the wood line. Remaining in place or withdrawing invited greater casualties. Using fire and movement, and their M79s to blow NVA snipers out of the trees, Bravo drove the enemy back into the jungle. One of the men wounded in the assault was Private First Class Frank Martin. Martin had badly burned his hands at Columbus the night before while handling a flare, but at Camp Holloway he had talked a doctor into leaving his trigger fingers exposed when his hands were bandaged. With 12 days left in the army, he had then returned to Columbus in a Chinook because he didn't want to let his buddies down. Leading the attack on the tree line, he was shot in the hip. This time Martin would not escape from the hospital. Lieutenant Colonel Ackerson, effectively in control at Albany, directed Tully and Forrest to establish a strong defensive position with their 2 companies around their single ship landing zone. They should be prepared to move northwest toward Albany at daybreak. The perimeter was established at about 7 p.m, but the 22 wounded men inside it would have to wait for medical evacuation. Ackerson didn't want to risk a night medevac. The helicopters that had taken de Duroc's Bravo 27 into the forward perimeter had carried out some of the wounded, but they had not yet taken out the dead. As a consequence, the number of casualties evacuated through Camp Holloway on the night of November 17th did not exceed 40, so no one at division had a clear understanding of the severity of the situation. Through the night, the defenders on Albany could hear NVA patrols moving through the area. Repeated pleas of "no, no, please" were ended with gunshots. The NVA were searching for wounded Americans and executing them. Just before midnight, Alpha and Bravo 15 heard a station on the radio using the call sign Ghost 46. He said that he and about 15 other men were wounded and cut off from their unit. Forrest and Tully decided to send out a patrol to find them. Platoon Sergeant Fred S. Klug, familiar with the terrain to their front, volunteered to lead 1st Platoon Alpha back toward Albany. Specialist 5 Daniel Torres, the senior aide man in Alpha Company, also volunteered. The patrol of 29 men, carrying litters for the wounded, were moving through the darkness toward Albany within minutes. Guided by pistol shots from Ghost 46, the Point Squad, led by Sergeant Alfred Montgomery, finally located the group. There were actually 45 men scattered around the area, with one large group near a sizable anthill. With the more seriously wounded men placed on the litters and joined by the walking wounded, Klug turned back to the 1-5 perimeter. Torres volunteered to remain behind with 18 wounded men, and Klug promised to return for them in the morning. All the wounded were from Charlie Company 2-7. After the patrol had departed, Torres crawled between the wounded, gathering the men tight around the anthill. He began treating their wounds, using his medical bag and the medical bags he found on the bodies of 2 dead medics. Then Torres heard the NVA patrols and the sickening screams and gunshots. When a patrol reached his position, Torres put down his medical kit and picked up an M60. He waited for the North Vietnamese to be close enough to almost touch them. Opening fire, he cut 3 men down, then sprayed the area from where they had come. Through the night, whenever he heard movement, Torres would pause treating the wounded to spray the area with the M60. A 2-platoon patrol was sent back into the area at daylight, a helicopter overhead calling out Ghost 46. While the wounded officer operated the radio, Torres threw out a smoke grenade, and with their position fixed, the patrol was guided to them. More wounded were discovered during a sweep of the area, and 35 men were pulled out. Torres would later be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Alpha and Bravo 1-5 evacuated the wounded, then started moving northwest toward Albany. The 2 companies discovered a scene of carnage. Dead and wounded were everywhere. They also found men that had their hands tied behind their backs and had then been shot in the back of the head. The Durex Bravo troopers were also moving out from Albany, and their discoveries were equally grim. They came across Americans that had been caught up in the artillery and napalm strikes. Their only consolation was that the men might already have been dead. The screening movements of Alpha and Bravo 1-5 and Bravo 2-7 indicated the NVA were no longer a threat to Albany, and the troopers then began to police the battlefield, collecting the dead and wounded and gathering equipment. Hueys evacuated the wounded and then began recovering the dead. A Chinook was then brought in and stacked full of bodies. Even then there was still more American dead to recover. At Columbus, members of Charlie Company 2-5 were heating their morning coffee when a young soldier staggered into their perimeter, asking for coffee and a cigarette. He explained he was from Charlie Company 7th Cavalry and had been in a big battle. The battalion surgeon, Dr. Frank Linotti, was summoned when the men noticed his gaping chest wound, and the wound was bandaged and morphine applied. A medevac was then called, but the man died from shock on the way to Camp Holloway. Division headquarters was still unaware of how serious the battle had been. A report from 3rd Brigade to the Division TOC on the afternoon of the 17th mentioned a contact in which half a dozen NVA were reported killed, with 2 American casualties. Then early on the 18th, Brigade reported McDade's men had suffered 1 man killed and 48 wounded, and a later report mentioned 303 NVA killed. Rick Merrin of the Associated Press had arrived at Albany with the Durex Bravo Company, and he had extracted with one of the first available aircraft to leave the landing zone. In the early morning of the 18th, he then staggered into the press tent at division headquarters. White as a sheet and nearly hysterical, he wanted to use the phone to call Saigon. There was no direct connection in the press tent, but 2 Corps Information Officer, Air Force Captain Larry Brown, allowed Merrin to use his phone, and the journalist was soon dictating a wild story about an ambush in the Ia Drang. When he returned to the press tent to arrange transportation to Saigon of the film he had shot at Albany, he was met by Knowles, who conducted a hasty debrief. At the same time, a warrant officer in the Division Casualty Branch at Camp Holloway informed Knowles that a dozen dead had arrived there, and more were arriving. Knowles sprinted to his helicopter and headed to 3rd Brigade. The fact the brigade had not reported the seriousness of the contact puzzled him. He told Neil Sheehan of the New York Times later that afternoon, "We had considerable rapid reaction forces in the area that could have been used if the brigade commander and myself had decided it was necessary." But he had not been given the opportunity to make that decision. And a brigade staff officer later said that Brown had told him not to make any more reports to division headquarters until he personally approved it, permission the officer said had never been given. However, it's questionable whether Brown could have done more. He could have dispatched all of 2nd Battalion 5th Cavalry from Columbus, replacing it with Moore's 1-7, and the battalion might have chased away the NVA execution squads, but Brown contended that he couldn't make a decision on reinforcement because of the lack of coherent information from Albany. Around 2 p.m, Brown decided to return the 215 companies to their parent battalion, and the two companies then headed back to Columbus. Brown would later acknowledge that his orders to reinforce McDade were too little and too late, but most of the casualties occurred in the first hour of fighting. They did not have decent security for moving through a jungle, and McDade would confirm that he didn't provide detailed reports of what was happening. I might have left Tim Brown in the dark about what was going on. I didn't really know myself until things quieted down. McDade's after-action report listed 303 enemy dead, but that didn't include losses inflicted by Forrest and Tully's companies. The division after-action report recorded 403 enemy losses by body count, and 100 more that couldn't be counted. A good indication of casualties is weapons taken, and at Albany 212 assault rifles and carbines, 39 light machine guns, 3 heavy machine guns, 6 82mm mortars, and 8 rocket launchers were recovered. It's clear that 8th Battalion, 66th Regiment was shattered by the Americans. Indeed, North Vietnamese histories later admitted the battalion had smashed the unit, killing or wounding nearly all of its officers, including its commander. And unlike X-Ray, where much of the damage was inflicted by artillery and tactical air support, Albany had been a close quarters fight. The Americans had won the fight in the sense they were still on Albany at the end of the battle, but the cost was horrendous. Charlie Company had suffered most with 41 dead, Alpha had 33 killed, and Delta lost virtually all of its anti-tank platoon and part of its mortar platoon. The final division report listed 151 Americans killed in action, 121 wounded, and 4 missing in action. The NVA had exhausted its supply system, and lacking sufficient food to sustain its troops, the commander of Military Region 5 recommended dissolving the Central Highlands Front and transferring its regiments to coastal provinces where they could be fed from the rice harvest. However, higher authorities, unaware of the scale of the clashes and convinced the Americans couldn't fight effectively in the region's mountains and jungles, turned down the recommendation. Propagandists in Hanoi would claim the Ia Drang campaign a heroic victory, but decades later it would be admitted that the battles had in fact devastated the NVA units militarily and psychologically. Dung Vu Hiep, a senior political officer, described the negativism and resistance of the survivors of the Ia Drang battles. The soldiers ignored orders from cadres. As many as 2/3 spent all day lolling in their hammocks, discussing all kinds of negative stories and subjects. In April 1966, Hal Moore, by then 3rd Brigade commander, would return to Albany, and a thorough search of the area found 8 bodies, 4 of them identified as Americans. No men had been left behind, and 4 mothers finally knew what had happened to their sons.